So, we're here for the 5th annual lecture by a young man who describes himself as a plumber by day and a scholar by night. Those of you who have had the opportunity of attending the others would know how deep, how rich, and how meaningful his presentations are. They're actually lectures. And for those of you who are not used to sitting and absorbing lectures, it requires you to pay attention if you are to actually gain anything from the experience. So, without too much further ado, I am going to be welcoming Jaden and his crew. But before that, I'd like to acknowledge and say thanks to those of you who have assisted. Tyrell, his brother, is outside. We have a main issue who will be coming. He'll be performing during the intermission. And his partner's here. She brought some provisions for us. So thank you. Thank you. We look forward to having that. Tasty corn soup, I believe. Yes, it is. Yeah. Can't wait. And of course, thank you to Jaden himself, to Maya, who he calls his first lady, and his beautiful children, Joella, and Judah. So they'll be coming out shortly, and we will give them the appropriate acknowledgement that they deserve. So again, thank you for your attention. And, you know, in the African tradition, there's a custom to ask permission to speak from the eldest person in the room. I've already violated that custom, but I can because I think I'm the eldest in the room. So I require no permission. However, I'm going to turn this thing upside down and seek permission from the youngest person in the room. Beautiful Ayala Rose, may I have the permission, your permission, my dear, to introduce none other than the presenter tonight. May I? I think I got an approval there. Thank you so much. So without further ado, I introduce to you Jaden, Ogé-Maxwell, and family.
Of an ancient monarchy, it's inscrutable word. Tell the world of them go ask and see. Love is the overall. Mobilized to geometric, crystalline geometry. All that in the car. Pick up the youth from
peace, power, Hotep, and good day, everyone. First and foremost, I want to take a moment to acknowledge everyone in the room for investing their time, energy, effort, finance, and love and belief into being here today. Amongst everywhere else we could be on this snowy February Canadian day, we chose to be here in the spirit of education, in the spirit of camaraderie, in the spirit of family and community. So I really want to thank from the bottom of my heart everyone for being in the room today. It means a lot to me. Secondly, before I move forward, as the beloved MC mentioned, it is customary in African tradition to formally request permission from all elders in the room before I begin speaking. So, elders, may I speak?
Yes.
Thank you very much. So welcome back. This is the 5th year African Heritage Month Showcase. The first year I was in my beloved my late grandmother's basement, dashed up some cloths, and I did my best. The year after we found ourselves in a studio. Following that, we found ourselves in the JCA Community Center offering the first public lecture. And this is the 5th year consecutively in a row I've offered something to the community. And this year, we are doing it in Etobicoke. For this year's 5th annual African Heritage Month Showcase, as you see on the screen titled, we have titled it, Afro is Indigenous. Now, I want to take an opportunity to highlight and give recognition to the First Lady, Maya, in the room, for it was her who actually inspired me to coin this title or coin this year's showcase, Afro is Indigenous. I expressed to her a desire to open the door and open the conversation surrounding the concept of indigeneity once again, and I highlighted how opportunistic of a moment this is to bridge a gap of misunderstanding and miseducation and dogma, honestly, that separates various communities from the First Nations, Aboriginal community with members of the African diaspora. So I think that it would be opportunistic and timely and respectful of me to take a moment to do my version of a formal land acknowledgement, and I want to take an opportunity to acknowledge that we are sitting in, gathering in, and communing on indigenous lands. I want to recognize the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. I want to acknowledge the Chippewa, and I want to acknowledge all of the different First Nations and Aboriginal communities whose blood, sweat, and tears have gone into creating this kind of space that we can enjoy today as Canadians. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Afro is Indigenous. I go by Jaden Sarah Jahutimas Ogé-Maxwell. I'm here with my family. We're gonna have two segments. In between, we will have an intermission with some beautiful corn soup. We'll have some music in the background, and we're gonna get into this. I wanna highlight that as a student of history and as a lover of wisdom leading into the idea of philosophia, I am not here to necessarily submit as many quote-unquote objective truths as I can, and I am not here to submit any foundational truths. But what I am here to do is to offer as much information and data as I can on a conversation surrounding indigeneity, and allow the conversation to be held with the community and allow for a new conversation to be opened up. A door of inquisitiveness, a door of curiosity, and a door of amalgamation is about to open up as it relates to the concept of indigeneity. So without further ado, we're going to head right on for the first slide. And I want to offer something of a preface to the presentation. So who we're looking on the screen here are two phenomenal scholars, master teachers in their own right, both of whom are no longer with us. On the left, you will see the late and great Runoku Rashidi, the author of African Star Over Asia. And on the right, you will see Ivan van Sertima, the author of They Came Before Columbus. So the preface and the reason why I have these particular elders on the screen right now to preface this presentation is because I would argue, and one would argue, that these two individuals did the foremost founding work as it relates to highlighting and expanding further our understanding of the African presence in the East, or the African presence in the East, as Runoku Rashidi did, and the African presence throughout Mesoamerica, which Ivan van Sertima did. Through his literature, They Came Before Columbus, as well as Runoku Rashidi's literature, African Star Over Asia. Many of the core thoughts and submissions that we're going to find being discussed in this lecture today are going to be coming out of one or two of these books. A lot of other literature has been incorporated into this lecture, like information from Dr. Joseph Benjamin Yanakinan's Africa, Mother of Western Civilization, History of Herodotus, Sheikh Anta Diop, George G.M. James, Chancellor Williams, Drusilla Junzi Houston, as well as Anthony Browder. But I do want to highlight that the foremost, the heavyweight and the anchor of this presentation is based on the works and scholarly contributions of Ivan van Sertima, as well as Runoku Rashidi. So I hope to be a new, somebody to further these individuals' work, compile them, condense them, and then birth something into a new. So this is my version of Sankofa, and I want to, once again, speak greatness into these individuals' names for the contributions. Runoku Rashidi traveled so many countries to be able to express to us the African presence in the East, and Ivan van Sertima did an amazing job throughout Mesoamerica. I want to highlight that one of his mentors, Alexander von Wutenhau, has expressed that if anybody is going to be making any kind of a statement on a public stage, you better have at least 2 or 3 sources to back it up. So with that energy behind that feeling, I'm going to do my best to offer you as many peer-reviewed journals, as many academic papers, and as many credible primary source testimonials as I can do to be able to properly articulate what I'm attempting to express to you, which is an indigenous African presence throughout North, South, and Central America. So without further ado, I begin. The slide 1. We're going to be looking at 2 major migrations. The first migration we are going to be looking at is one which some have spoken about for decades, if not centuries, Others have laughed at and ridiculed and speak in very comedic manners whenever it relates to a migration which would have occurred off of the west coast of Africa, the continent of Africa, into the Gulf of Mexico. That is the topic of a lot of rhetoric, a lot of funny jokes or whatnot. But as somebody who's looked into the conversation and somebody who studied it, that is indeed a migration which I would submit has objectively did occur. And what I'm going to be doing today is, as for the first migration, I'm going to be highlighting, as I mentioned, the migration which would have occurred off the west coast of Africa into the Gulf of Mexico, which would have taken place anywhere around the 1200 years before the Common Era to 700 years. And that is the migration to deal with the Olmecs, or also known as people of the rubber. So the way I'm going to do this, I do encourage everyone to just stay visually captivated in the illustrations visually that I have up. I will knock down these slides and I will hit each slide as appropriate, and I will articulate and re-express to them what we just read so that we all stay on the same page. So our first slide, we read, after being exposed to rumors which were circulating around 1858 of Mexican peasants coming from a huge stone head, an American archaeologist named Michael W. Sterling led a joint team of archaeologists from the Smithsonian Institution of National Geographic during the year 1938. So what you hear is that as of the late 19th century, upwards of 1858, people began whispering and tales began being told of peasants and people of the lower social class going through the swamps and the bushes of Tres Zapotes and La Venta in the Gulf of Mexico, not too far from Guatemala. And it was around 1938 that the Smithsonian Institute actually sent out a team led by Michael W. Sterling. So the first whispers of the Olmec was during the 19th century, and we had the first expedition going on to 1938. The second bullet point reads that, given the science of radiocarbon dating did not become introduced throughout archaeological sites until the year 1946, prior to this time, the best estimate given to these Negroid-type heads, some as tall as 8.5 feet in height and 22 feet in circumference, they estimated that they would probably be around born 291 years before the Common Era. That was the best guess before radiocarbon dating. Now, the next slide shows us that more further expeditions took place in La Venta, Tres Zapotes, and Veracruz around Guatemala, which took place around 1955 to 1956 by members of the National Geographic Smithsonian University of California. And after those expeditions took place, the official radiocarbon dating of these heads began to show a date of an entrance of these individuals into the Gulf of Mexico, which would have taken place anywhere in between 1160 to 580 years before the Common Era. Given that with radiocarbon dating, you do have to leave about 120 years or so of wiggle room. So anywhere between that point in time is a very good place that we could be looking. Now, given the distinct parallels which exist between the garments, helmets, and rituals, as well as the phenotypic traits of the Olmecs, as well as the African Nubians of Egypt, many scholars have attempted to observe what would have been happening throughout the Nile Valley during this time period, which would have potentially encouraged a migration of this nature. So I want to highlight that one of the main things that people discuss about the Olmecs are their helmets. Now, when you look at their helmets and you actually hop, skip, and jump into the Nile Valley, what you'll notice is that many of the helmets of the Nubian soldiers of the 25th dynastic period during the end of the 4th Golden Age had exactly the same helmet type structures as we see here today. No, that does not necessarily mean that they're the same people and this means A plus B, but that is something to take into consideration and for us to peg and ask the question, how is it that we are finding the same phenotypes and the same headwear, the same garments, and the same ritual practices, which we will begin looking into in two different places. I am not going to make a random objective statements about a theory of diffusion and transmission, but I will highlight the data that is synchronistic and that I think is worth speaking on. So that's the first slide, the first migration of the Olmecs. One further. So this will serve as our first primary source testimonial. Now, by primary source, what I mean is that this paper here was appeared in an 1869 edition of a paper known as the Mexican Society of Geography and Statistics by a man named Ogé-Maxwell. So this is a testimonial from somebody who existed in the time, actually saw the artifacts, and wrote about it. So this, although this is a few centuries away from where we are, this will serve as our first primary testimony in regards to who spoke about these heads and these artifacts and these megalithic structures and what was said about them. So I looked into the primary source testimony, and what you notice is that in between the pages 292 to 297, Jose gives his testimony surrounding the discovery of what he describes as, quote, an astonishing and a magnificent structure which represented Ethiopic type features, and that he reflected that that there had definitely been Negroes in this country from its beginning. Jose Meglar. Although a vast majority of the Olmecs heads were crafted with such precise workmanship to highlight the details which resemble to many the distinct phenotypic characteristics, members of Western academia, such as Michael Coe, a Yale anthropologist, have made statements which suggested that the Olmec heads have, quote, broad noses and thick lips because the tools were used to cut them were too blunt to make sharper noses and thinner lips. So what we're hearing is a testimony from the academics of Yale, anthropologists, and academia, which suggests that although these people made such a beautiful head and everything is carved with such meticulousness, the reason why their lips look the way they do and their nose look the way they do is because, quote unquote, their tools that used to cut them were too blunt to make sharper noses. I'll leave that with you guys and we'll see how you feel about it. The last quote, the last bullet we have here says that given that throughout Western academia, I want to make sure that we arrive at a consensus and we know what the current leading premises are as it relates to these things. As it relates to the current leading premise, Western academia and the common current consensus shows that there is, quote, no credible archaeological, skeletal, or genetic evidence which shows that Africans migrated to or lived in Mesoamerica during the Olmec period. Once again, around 1200 BCE to 580. Great lengths have been taken on scholarly grounds to verify the African presence throughout Mesoamerica, and I want to reiterate, I would like to see myself as something of a Renaissance man who has dabbled in craniomorphology, paleosteology, anthropology, world migration patterns to do my best effort to revisit the notion again. And I'm not going to be making, and while I will not be making objective statements, I will leave the community and the audience who view this nationally and internationally one day to answer the question from themselves. Is there zero evidence to support the notion? We're going to find out. All right, third slide. Distant relatives, the Olmec connection to the Nile Valley. We read here, and this is a quote out of Ivan van Sertima's They Came Before Columbus. He says, it is said that the Olmecs were a people of three faces. Once again, three faces. One reflecting the traits of the earliest Paleo-American settlers, a second often described as Africoid or Negroid, and I will highlight that those are very older anthropological terms, Africoid, Negroid, and you're going to see them more so in the 1920s or 30s. These aren't really terms that are going to be used as much anymore in academia, and that's fine, but I want to stay as authentic to the source of what we're talking about, which highlights the remarkable morphological and cranial diversity of their population. A third revealing subtle variation that made them uniquely Mesoamerican, while the craniometric analysis of the Polish physical anthropologist named Andrzej Wisniewski do not meet the standards of Western academia to be considered proof of an African presence in Mesoamerica. They offer us a historical lens through which to explore the human variation, using the resources and evidence available to us, which will include art, architecture, ritual symbolism, and comparative morphology. We will investigate the rich complexity of the Olmec civilization and the intriguing parallels it may share with other great Nile Valley cultures. So in this illustration here, I got out of Anthony Browder's Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization, and it highlights an Olmec head, but at the back, when you take the helmet off, what do you see? Braids that you would see that on my head in grade 3. This is someone comes from Mesoamerica, but we have to keep in mind the phenotypic traits, which include skin pigmentation, hair color, hair texture, and we have to highlight, for whatever it's worth, when you take off the Olmec heads, many of them have braids that you will look like if I braided my own hair. This is another very beautiful image that comes out of They Came Before Columbus, and this shows the parallels or just a similarity between the craniometric structure and the phenotypic traits of an Olmec head, which was found in Tres Zapotes, as well as in comparison with the Nuba chief from Kenya. I want to highlight that while 1 plus 2 may not necessarily equal 3 all the time, I do want to bring attention to the phenotypic traits and to the craniomorphology. This is a beautiful image, also coming out of Nile Valley Contributions to Civilizations, and I want to highlight that this is an incredible sculpture that it is in a museum in San Andres Tuxtla, Veracruz, Mexico. And now I want to quote what you when you walk into the museum in Mexico. This statement and excerpt is written above it, and I'll read it for the community. It says, quote, "This is the root of your history, its cradle and its altar. Listen to the most silent voices of the most ancient culture in Mexico, the mother of civilization of our continent. The Olmecs converted rain into harvest, the sun into a calendar, stone into sculpture, cotton into cloth, pilgrimage into commerce, mountains into thrones, jaguars into religion, and men into gods." So once again, I want to highlight, different parallels between culture. There was a lot of discussion of ancient chiefs of West Africa also working with the rain and working with, rain dances and things of that nature. And when it comes to jaguars and adornments and things of that nature, you'll learn in Sheikh Anta Diop's African Origin of Civilization that it was very common in Nubian ancestry for the priests to be adorned in jaguars and to be wearing jaguar skin of that nature. So this is a nice image to show some parallels and to highlight once again, I am not here to say that the Olmecs are all black people and the Olmecs are all African, because that would be historically inaccurate. I want to say once again, the Olmec have three faces. One of the first Paleo-Americans, an Africoid and a Negroid, and then one that appears to be Phoenician. There's a mixture and amalgamation, which we will see. This is a very multi-layered story, and I won't fluff it up for anyone. Moving forward. Cause for connection. As I made mention, it is very interesting to look at what was occurring in other parts of the world during a point in time of a specific migration. I want to highlight that while we weren't there and we cannot say certain things definitively, what we can speak to is what was occurring in different parts of the world, especially what would have been occurring in an area like the Nile Valley or like Egypt, which to some people they speak of as high culture, as a place of zenith. What would have been occurring in Egypt to encourage and to promote or to suggest or to move a body of people to hop, jump, and skip out of the Nile Valley and enter the Gulf of Mexico? This is the leading theory. So in terms of a cause for connection, what could have been happening? Let's look at what was happening in the Nile Valley. So this is a picture of a page out of African Origin, Mother of Western Civilization by Dr. Ben, and this is a chronology of the ancient dynastic period. So I said we're in the 25th dynasty. So the 25th dynasty of Kush is in between 751 to 656 before the Common Era. All right, so now let's go down the bullet slides. The Nile Valley in and around the time period where much of the Olmec migrations appears to have taken place in between 800 to 600 BCE reveal a melting pot of turmoil and conflict which was taking place between the Nubians and the ruling kings of Assyria. Now, prior to the Nusut Biti, which just means the pharaoh, ruler of Upper and Lower Kemet, prior to the Nusut Biti Pianki ever marching north into Lower Egypt, which happened in 750 BCE, the region was already unstable due to a serious aggressive expansion under Tiglath-Pileser III. Now, it was said that Pianki's campaign, which was underway 730 to 728 BCE, brought religious legitimacy into Memphis, Egypt, and forced northerners to submit and swear loyalty. Now, as you move forward, you read that in 716 to 702 BCE, the Phoenicians were actively supporting the Egyptians in Memphis. Now, moving forward, when you want to look at a very important year is the year 671 BCE, which is smack dab before the end of the 25th dynasty. The Assyrians launched a full-scale invasion of Egypt and marched through the Sinai with overwhelming force. Memphis, the military stronghold, is captured, and Taharqa, the African ruler of the Nile Valley, retreats up south back into Nubia in the year 663 BCE. Because remember, when we're speaking of up south, you have to remember that the topography of the Nile Valley shows that they came from the mountains of the moons. And while all of this conflict would be happening in the Levant, whenever people would come in from the coast of Canaan and things got too hardcore for the Cushites, they retreated up south to a place which was their homeland in the mountains of the moon. So around 671, we have the Assyrians launching a full-scale invasion. Taharqa fled back up into the mountains of the moon. The final blow is dealt when Thebes is sacked and the Cushites permanently retreat into Nubia, which ended the 25th dynasty of Kemet. So I mentioned Pianki and I mentioned Shabaka. Pianki was the ruler between 751 to 716, and Shabaka, the ruler after, in between 716 to 701. So these were the rulers that were reigning during the 25th dynasty of Kemet, which I am supposing and I'm submitting were the rulers during the most conflicting time towards the end of the Fourth Golden Age. Moving forward. This will serve as our second primary source testimony, and this one's very interesting. This one is about something called, I learned about in the middle of this lecture, or in the compilation of this, called the Victory Stele of Esarhaddon. Can we all try saying Esarhaddon? Beautiful. This comes from 671 BCE, the same time period. Now, this stele was discovered in the year 1888 in Turkey's Gaziantep province. Now, this victory stele, which is carved out of dolerite stone, an extraordinarily hard stone, and authored by the Assyrian scribes in Acadia, an Akkadian cuneiform, was created to commemorate the return of Esarhaddon after his second battle and a victory over the Nasut-Biti and Kush, 671. Now, the destruction and devastation administered by the Kushites to the Kushites by the Assyrians was translated out of the cuneiform and tells a story where, quote, this is a quote out of the cuneiform, Memphis, his royal city, in a half day, with mines, tunnels, assaults, I besieged, I captured, I destroyed, I devastated, I burned with fire. His queen, his court, his heir, and the rest of his sons and daughters, I carried off to Assyria. I tore up the root of Cush from Egypt. It sounds like the Cushites and the Egyptians had their hands full. They were being destroyed. The roots are being torn up. So this is a time capsule and a jump back in time to look at the nature of conflict of affairs between the Assyrians, who were pushing up to forward into the Levant, and the Cushites. It wasn't polite. Now, the next bullet point, you read, with land routes within the Nile Valley collapsed and a new empire squeezing in from all sides, scholars have theorized that the Kushites took to the sea as an escape valve from the Assyrian military dominance which was taking place on the land. With the Phoenicians already using the stars to navigate the waters and trading as far as Iberia and West Africa, we propose a long-distance, high-risk voyage into new lands weren't as insane as they were a rational response to unfavorable circumstances. So essentially, once again, it's very natural for human beings. This place isn't working for us anymore. It doesn't work with the Assyrians. We're brethren with the Phoenicians, and I'm going to break this down in Ebonics if you want. We're going to break our brethren with the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians know how to sail. It's not impossible nor unlikely to theorize and hypothesize of a scenario which had it that the Kushites of the 25th dynasty saw better favor in their lineage taking to the seas and getting up out of there from the Assyrians. I want to mention that there is a biblical, I don't know if I missed it, but there is this is mentioned in this conflict is mentioned in the Bible. Now, although I'm not a Christian by any means, I do like to take advantage of an opportunity to look into the Bible and to highlight any historicity which I do see. So in this instance, I want to encourage us all to open our book to 2 Kings 19:9, which explicitly speaks of this Neo-Assyrian Empire invading Judah and Taharka intervening. This is a biblically referenced in a scenario here. So when we got a primary source and we got biblical references about this conflict, which could potentially have been used as a cause for connection. Into the Gulf of Mexico, traversing the currents of the world. Now, this illustration comes out of Ivan Van Sertima's They Came Before Columbus, and this is a beautiful picture because very quickly, you don't have to be a scholar or an academic in any capacity to interpret what you're looking at here. And what we're looking at here is the worldwide currents of the earth, of the world. We see here the Benguela current, which you can jump from South Africa and go right up. We see over here the equatorial counter current. We see the Canary Current, which goes into the northeast trades, which goes into the north equatorial current. So without us knowing, technically and theoretically, any competent sailor, any competent sea-savvy individual with a good enough boat, if you jump under the water and you follow currents to a certain degree, you'd be surprised where you'd land and you'd end up. So let's run it down. The foundations of modern Portuguese Atlantic exploration didn't begin until the middle of the 14th century, with their navigational technique, which was known as volta do mar, used during the Age of Discovery. Now, during the fourth and last golden age of Kemet, I want to let it be known, a pharaoh known as Neku II, who reigned from 609 to 594 BCE, commissioned Admiral Hanno of the Carthaginian Empire to circumnavigate the continent of Africa with a fleet of more than 50 ships and over 2,000 sailors and officers who are said to have made it as far back as Senegal before turning back. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the geography of the world, the Pillars of Hercules is right where the Strait of Gibraltar is, right in the northwestern area of like Mauritania, where the Moors were able to enter the Iberian Peninsula and Spain in the 7th century BCE. So what's being said here is that 600 years before the birth of Christ, Admiral Hanno of the Carthaginian Empire circumnavigated the west coast of Africa, got as far back as potentially Guinea before turning back. So we do have confirmation of people sailing the waters and navigating the waters in between the Iberian Peninsula and the Pillars of Hercules and crossing into the west coast of Africa. Who's to say whether or not a member of this 2,000 of this 50 ships caught the Canary Current? I can't guarantee they did, but we can't rule it out, and I want to attest to that. I want to also attest that in the histories of Herodotus, it's documented that during the same time, a crew of Phoenicians were sent by Neku II to circumnavigate the entire continent of Africa. It was said that they left from the Red Sea, which would have been over here, and after 3 years, they sailed back through the Pillars of Hercules. So these are documented occurrences from the father of history of a circumnavigation through the Pillars of Hercules onto the west coast of Africa, as well as from the Red Sea to the whole continent. So this is high-level navigation and seafaring. Now, the individuals who did this circumnavigation were the Phoenicians, but once again, I'm not really drawing too strict of a distinction between the Phoenicians and the Kemites, and we'll get into that later. Now, I want to highlight, once again, as I just mentioned, I'll go through the bullets. The worldwide currents of the world show that if a competent sailor found themselves along the coast of West Africa, they could indeed ride the Canary Current into the northeast equatorial, which would eventually carry you right into the Gulf of Mexico. Now, in the year 1970, a Norwegian ethnographer named Thor Heyerdahl, who was born 1914 to 2012, was famous for testing theories of ancient transoceanic travel. He sailed a papyrus boat built and modeled off of more ancient boats of the Nile Valley from Spain into the Canary Islands, across the Atlantic, and eventually he landed in Barbados after approximately 57 days at sea, spanning more than 6,100 kilometers. So this is a documented instance. 1970, a Norwegian man did an experiment. He left the west coast of Africa. He ended up in Barbados. So no one can really tell me that this isn't possible. And if people in modern day are doing this, knowing that matters which were happening during antiquity or of a higher degree of building, we have to highlight that these things have already happened, and it's not as far-fetched as some of us might like to suggest. Are we all on the same page so far? Do you have any questions, anyone? Awesome. Okay, so here are some illustrations. This is the picture of a depiction of the boat. It was called Ra the First, built by African boatmen. From Lake Chad. They built this papyrus boat. I want to highlight the first trip they made in 1969 failed. They did have a failed attempt, but they ran it back, and in 1970 they got it. Over here is something called the Piri Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513 from earlier maps found in the Library of Alexandria by the Turkish admiral Piri Piri Reis. It depicts fairly accurate latitudinal and longitudinal relationships between the Atlantic coastlines of Africa and South America. So we have maps going back to the 16th century showing the latitude and longitude, and that these are not really too far-fetched of concepts to be working with here. So while some might want to laugh and mock and ridicule the notion of the potential of a migration of some sorts, there's documented historicity which suggests that it's not that far-fetched as we might like to think. Okay? Beautiful imagery out of Africa, they came before Columbus. Ivan van Sertima. The solar bark of Khufu, 2600 BC. So in terms, if we're going to be doing all this talking about navigation, about seafaring, about ships, all the things of that nature, we do have to take a moment and look at the history of boats, ships, barges of that nature. We got to get grounded in that sense. So the first bullet that we see here, much of this, the information for this particular slide comes out of Anthony Browder's Nile Valley Contribution to Civilization. Excellent read. We read in our first bullet point that while the use of basic canoes can be traced back to Nigeria through use of what was known as the Dafuna canoe, which is over 6,000 years before the birth of Christ, the oldest recognized and best preserved large vessel solar barge recorded in history can be found in ancient Egypt and is known as the Ship of Khufu, which is what we see here. This goes back to the 6th dynastic period around 2600 BCE. So this is deep antiquity at this point in time. Now, this was discovered in the year 1954, and this very impressive large barge was buried in a narrow pit some 43 meters long and was disassembled into 1,200 pieces after being reassembled. The barge measured to be about 143 feet long and approximately 18 feet wide. Now, I want to highlight that in addition, in the fall of 1991, Egyptologists from the Penn-Yale expedition discovered an additional fleet of 12 royal ships, which were found at Abydos in an ancient burial ground some 280 miles south of Cairo. These ships were measured at 50 to 60 feet long and are estimated to be about 5,000 years old, which makes them older than the boat of Khufu by a few centuries. So when it comes to boat building, ships, barges of that nature, we have to highlight that the competency to be canoeing on the waters is a very ancient concept, which we can see in Nigeria, West Africa, 6,000 years before the birth of Christ. But over 2,600 years before the birth of Christ, we do see, I want to highlight, I didn't mention it, but this barge was more of a royal barge. It was not really, this particular barge I want to highlight was not necessarily built to be seaworthy, and I am not suggesting that this barge was used to make that expedition, but what I am suggesting is we have to highlight the high capability and capacity and the knowledge of shipbuilding, and we have to look at the extent of how shipbuilding was looked at around 2,600 years before the birth of Christ. So this is a solar bark of Khufu, very ancient boat. Moving forward. Quetzalcoatl, the feather serpent of Mesoamerica. So now we enter the world of Mesoamerica. And I want to tread lightly here because as a historian, I have an extraordinary amount of respect for different cultures, and never in my life would I want to step on a culture or misrepresent it. But I do want to highlight some important things about Mesoamerican culture, and in this case, as it relates to Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. Now, my first bullet point reads that the mythology of Quetzalcoatl originates in a pre-literate time of Mesoamerica and is first materially attested in the architecture and iconography of Teotihuacan. Now, Quetzalcoatl served first and foremost as a civilizing intelligence throughout Mesoamerica, but was also associated with being the teacher of a sacred knowledge who is said to have established ritual order by regulating intellectual and moral life. So while I am not depicting and presenting Quetzalcoatl as a literal deity, I want to highlight and emphasize that Quetzalcoatl was perceived as a bringer of knowledge, a bringer of civilization order, and calendrical order as well, which we'll look at too, calendrical order. Quetzalcoatl's iconography is embedded in timekeeping monuments such as the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, associated with solar and seasonal cycles at El Castillo, where equinoxes produce the serpent-like phenomenon. This architectural integration indicates that Quetzalcoatl was understood as a personification of calendrical order, seasonal renewal, and sacred time. Now, Quetzalcoatl's association with the East is very notable when it's always mentioned that the sea, and he is always foretold and described as somebody who is going to be returning from back east. And there are certain 13th century myths potentially associated with Abu Bakari of Mali, which always talks about Quetzalcoatl and his companions being individuals of burned and dark, who represent people who are burned and dark by the sun, as if bathed in sacred fire. Quotes of this nature have encouraged scholars of comparative history to view this narrative as a part of a broader civilizational archetype of solar wisdom and order, which align closely with the role of the Kemetic nature known as Tehuti or Thoth, who served as the guardian of time, knowledge, and cosmic balance. Now, I want to highlight a few things that are very important with this is matters of Quetzalcoatl being associated with architecture that are in alignment with equinoxes and is in alignment with seasonal cycles and seasons of renewal and things of that nature. Because it's not everywhere in the world that you're going to find architecture aligned with either equinoxes or solstices and things of that nature. That takes people being able to observe the stars for at least 1,000 years. It's not every day you find that in alignment, but as it relates to Quetzalcoatl, what I have come to learn is that you cannot separate the civilizing intelligence of Quetzalcoatl with matters of calendrical order, seasonal renewal, and sacred time. Now, as somebody who likes performing comparative analysis and comparative studies, I want to look at where else you see things of this nature happening. Boom. Tehuti, Thoth, bringer of civilization and guardian of sacred knowledge. Now, within the African spiritual framework, once pre-creation and cosmic creation were established throughout the Ogdode and the great Ennead of Heliopolis, Tehuti and Thoth emerges as one of the first netures or forces of nature whose role was not to create the universe, but to introduce divine intelligence, measuring, articulating, and regulating the existence through time, sacred speech, knowledge, and cosmic balance. Now, I just said a few things which are kind of out of nowhere. The first word I wanted to call is the Ogdode. Now, for some people who have seen my and I's presentation as it relates to a creation story through yoga, you are familiar with us speaking about how matters of pre-creation began in a very dark abyss, infinitely potential body of feminine etherical water known as the primordial waters of noon, the triple darkness in alignment to the woman's womb. So the Ogdode are the first four pairs of nature, or the first personalities or essences of God, which emerge from this body of water, known as Nun and Nunet, Ha, Hahet, Kuk, Kaket, and Amun and Amunet, who represent water, space, darkness, and invisibility, all things womb wisdom. So the Tehuti, he does not come right off of the beginning of the Ogdode. And we also mentioned the great Ennead of Heliopolis. So this is the great Ennead. After matters of pre-creation are fulfilled, then matters of creation can be fulfilled. And it is said is that the Necher Atum sat on top of a primordial hill that rose out of the waters and expressed pairs of nature that would be his limbs. The first limb was Shu and Tefnut, air and moisture, then Geb and Nut. So Tehuti came right after this. So once matters of creation came about, and we have Aset and Asar as the first man and woman archetype, Tehuti was one of the first natures who came after that. Now, later esoteric traditions, most notably translations attributed to the Emerald Tablets, portray Tehuti as a civilizing intelligence in the same likeness as Quetzalcoatl, who periodically restored higher knowledge, symbolically emerging from something known as the halls of Amenti. Now, when considered alongside verifiable historical accounts of a vast sacred complex, such as the Hawara labyrinth, also mentioned in the histories of Herodotus, as I mentioned, described in the histories of Herodotus, along the demonstrable astronomical precision and harmonic design of the Nile Valley architecture, these traditions reinforce Tehuti's enduring association with sacred science, hidden knowledge, and the regeneration of civilization. Now, archaeoastronomical research offered to us through works of Robert Bauval and Thomas Brophy in their publication Black Genesis, which we have on the table here if anyone wants to look at it. It's an amazing book, reveals that the step pyramid complex of Saqqara, designed by Imhotep as a monumental timekeeping system that required alignment with the nature. In this way, the Saqqara complex reflects Tehuti's principle of regulating existence through time, sacred knowledge, and cosmic order. So I want to highlight, we just came from a slide talking about how Quetzalcoatl is built into architecture in Teotihuacan and is tracking equinoxes. So that means by default, Quetzalcoatl too is associated with calendrical order, is associated with timekeeping and seasonal renewal. The way that this all brings us back by default into how women of deep antiquity were seen as the first keepers of time is going to be very beautiful. I know the First Lady, my beloved Maya, and I always chuckle as to no matter how you look at things, no matter where you look at things, by default, it usually always goes back to water and women. Moving forward. The step pyramid of Saqqara complex, architecture as encoded time. Now, the step pyramid complex of Saqqara was constructed in between 2780 and 2680 BCE during Egypt's third dynasty for King Djoser. It was designed by the pre-scientist, polymath, or Renaissance man, Imhotep, who was later revered as the world's first architect, physician, astronomer, and the earliest monumental stone complex in history. Now, the Saqqara complex represents a decisive shift from simple mastaba tombs to a fully integrated sacred architectural system. Now, I want to slow this bullet down because the implications are crazy. So this illustration out of the Saqqara complex comes out of Africa, mother of Western civilization, Dr. Benjamin Yunakinan, Yosef Benjamin Yunakinan, another great read. And now, we always talk about the step pyramid, but we don't talk about the complex. If you look around here, the step pyramid is engulfed and encapsulated by a huge complex of pillars, right? Now, as it relates to the pillars, timekeeping, calendrical order, seasonal alignment, I want us to listen to this. I just learned this. The Saqqara complex is enclosed by a massive limestone wall approximately 1,800 feet long, 900 feet wide, and 30 feet high, enclosing more than 1 square mile of sacred space. Entry into the complex passes through a colonnade of a 40-stone column interpreted as representing Egypt's administrative provinces. Okay? Now, research synthesized by Robert Bauval and Thomas Brophy in Black Genesis, I really think you guys should get that book, demonstrates that the massive paneled enclosure wall of the step pyramid complex of Saqqara encode precise numerical counts corresponding to the 360-day sidereal and the 1460-year Sothic cycle associated with Sirius, revealing that its designers were tracking stellar precession and heliacal rising of Sirius, the annual rising of Sirius, knowledge essential for regulating agricultural cycles, ritual calendars, and cosmic order of the Nile Valley. Coincidence? You tell me. So what this shows me here, as somebody who's something of an antiquarian and something who's looking at matters of antiquity, is whoever designed the step pyramid was so precise to ensure that the amount of columns and pillars around the pyramid are in alignment with the Sothic cycle. On every 1,460 years or so, that star Sirius would come back around. And once again, I want to highlight that it all stems back to being able to track the rise of these stars to be able to interpret and predict when the flood would happen. Imagine living in a world where floods were not a catastrophe and there was something to be leveraged. We know the flood's coming. It's going to be a high flood, low flood, and let's utilize that to bring through high culture through agriculture. Prior to the emergence of monumentally aligned pyramid complexes in Mesoamerica, I submit that the Nile Valley civilization stands as the earliest documented high culture to consistently integrate solar, stellar, and calendrical alignments into a large-scale sacred architecture, which is demonstrated at sites such as the Step Pyramid Complex of Saqqara, the Karnak Temple Complex, or Ipet Isut, and the Mortuary Temple of Hatshepsut, which establishes a clear architectural precedent that is later mirrored in Mesoamerican ceremonial centers. So I want to emphasize, I am not in any way, shape, or form saying the designers and architects who built the Step Pyramid Complex jumped into Mesoamerica and did the same thing there. But you have to ask yourself, who else in the world was building at such a zenith? Who else in the world were tracking the precession of the equinox to be able to build their architecture like the Ipet Isut, which would have it that when the birth of the new sun would be coming near Easter, or where the birth of the sun that would come after the winter solstice, the sun beams right into the Holy of Holies. The sun beams right down the columns. So if somebody wants to highlight who else was a building like this, jump in the chat and let's talk about it. Until then, we're moving forward. The sons of Heru, guardian of the fourfold cosmic order. So now that we've began speaking of fourfold cosmic order and cosmology, I want us to pay attention because things are about to get really cool. Now, for those of you who don't know what we're looking at, this is a depiction out of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, or the Pirat Heru, which is over there if you want to see it. And what we're looking at is Asar, the first god man, and his wife, his co-regent Aset. I want us to keep in mind on top of Aset, as typical, she is depicted with a throne above her head because it is the mother who serves as the first throne as the king, which is why I always have the throne here. This is everything Aset, everything divine mother. And in front of them are the four sons of Heru. By the old kingdom of Kemet, 2686 to 2181 BCE, Egyptian theology had articulated a fourfold cosmic order, which was embodied by the four sons of Heru. These were, and I want you to listen to the words that I'm saying, because in the next slide it's going to get really interesting. They were protective spiritual forces associated with regeneration and balance. Their names were Imseti, who was the human, Hapi, the baboon, Dua Muftef, the jackal, and Quebesenuf, who was the falcon. Each represented one of four cardinal directions of the sky, and each were represented by the 4 annual seasons. Okay? Now the pyramid text of Unas provided the earliest explicit reference of the 4 sons of Heru, describing them as guardians who stand beside the king and protect his body and regeneration. At this earliest stage, they functioned purely as a fourfold protective system without any explicit association with the cardinal directions of the world or seasons. You can hear mention of them in the pyramid text, utterances 148 and 251. Check it out. Moving forward, during the Middle Kingdom of Kemet, 2100 to 1675 BCE, so this is a few centuries after the fact, the emergence of the coffin text expanded sacred knowledge beyond royalty and transformed an earlier royal theology into a formal cosmological science. Within this system, the 4 sons of Heru, who once guarded only the kings, were recontextualized as cosmic regulators, positioned at the 4 corners of the sky or earth, and associated with the cardinal directions which were referenced in the coffin text, spells 335 and 778. Now, taken together, this raises a critical question. If a civilizing intelligence grounded in a fourfold cosmology was fully articulated in the Nile Valley, as we see here, what are the implications of encountering the same theological and cosmological framework in the foundational phases of Mesoamerican civilization? So, in layman's terms, and to put it simplistically, what are the odds if we find a fully articulated fourfold cosmology associated with the 4 directions of the 4 directions, 4 seasons, and guardianship? What are the implications if we find something like that pop up in another part of the world? What are the odds? Some would say, some would laugh, some would say impossible. I say, let's talk about it. From fourfold order to sky bearers, this might be one of my favorite slides, and I want us to capture this moment. A 2024 peer-reviewed study published in Latin America and Antiquity by Cambridge University Press on behalf of the Society for American Archaeology demonstrates that early La Venta ceremonial architecture in between 1100 and 750 BCE was intentionally oriented according to the astronomical and calendrical principles. Once again, we're dealing with calendrical principles rather than random placements. Detailed analysis reveals consistent alignments with the rising and setting points of the sun, which reveal consistent indicating an early integration of cosmic order built into space. Now, during the Proto-Mayan period, 400 to 250 years before the birth of Christ, an earlier Olmec spatial cosmology evolved into symbolic and mythic forms. This can most clearly be seen at the archaeological site Izapa, where central world tree imagery, like the one we see here, and symmetrical stele compositions and emerging narrative scenes reflect a shift from what was once architectural cosmograms to a now visualized cosmic order with directional balance. So once again, right here in Mesoamerica, in the beginning of Mesoamerican history, we see architecture being aligned with the rising and setting of the sun, and we see symmetry and tree imagery aligning with calendrical orders. Now, by the classical Maya period, I'm a bit of the kind of historian I am. Dates are very important. I'm not going to overlook them. Now, by the classical Maya period, 250 BCE to 900 years before the Common Era, the fourfold cosmology that had developed across earlier Mesoamerican traditions became fully articulated through the Bacabs, the 4 directional deities who structured the world and sky. I want us to repeat. Can we say the first name? Khan Bacab. Was represented yellow and represented the south. Shak Bacab was represented red and east. Zak Bacab represented white and the north. And Ik Bacab, who was represented black in the west. Now I have to take a moment to recognize how beautiful it is to be with a woman, and to be with a woman who articulates these things, and who serves as a vessel and a transmuter of divine information. I can't express enough how interesting and how much it tickles me to know that I've been digging through books for months, Fourfold Cosmology, Mayan Bacabs, Sons of Heru, and then I remembered. It's very interesting because the week before, my beloved Maya, the First Lady, was telling me that the cycles that a woman goes through, let's see if I remember this properly, the follicular, menstruation, ovulation, and luteal. We gotta love the luteal. How can we forget luteal? Gotta love the luteal. So, it shouldn't be viewed as a coincidence that the cycles that a woman go through are very synonymous with the fourfold cosmology originally articulated in the Nile Valley, which dealt with tracking the rise of Sirius to predict the flood of the Nile. Follicular, luteal, menstrual ovulation. So once again, whether we're looking at the stars, whether we're looking at architecture, or whether we're trying to track what season our woman is in, as a historian and somebody who is deep in antiquity and history, what I'm starting to learn is the more we can track the stars, like the same way that the first god being a father, the first god who was a farmer, and the first farmer who was a husband was able to track the stars to predict when the Nile is going to flood. I, as somebody who is leading into husbandry, should be able to track the seasonal comings and the renewal and the cycles of my partner to track when I can work with her. So I see cosmology through the Nile Valley architecture, through Mayan cosmology, and through the movements of women who are in tune with their cycles. So I want to thank Maya for letting me know all this kind of stuff. And yeah, root women. How might a fourfold cosmological system, which was first articulated in the Nile Valley, associated with the divine forces of nature, with the four cardinal directions, later emerged in Mesoamerica? Once again, coincidence? You tell me. Moving on. This is a snapshot of the peer-reviewed journal that I just mentioned, the one that came out of Cambridge University in 2024. So I'll read it for you real quick. Not all of it, but the parts that are interesting. As revealed by our analyses, most orientations were based on astronomical and calendrical principles, occasionally combined with a certain concept of sacred geography, while the results of these analyses were presented in a recently published article. You guys can look it up yourself, but don't quote me. Quote Cambridge University. The original architecture of Mesoamerica was indeed associated with calendrical seasonal cycles. Okay, moving forward. The matrifocal origins of humanity. It always goes back to women, I tell you. Aset as the throne of divine nourishment. So who we see here is Aset, the first archetype of the divine mother. She is known to the Greeks as Isis, and she emerges within the Heliopolitan theology as a central figure of the great Ennead. As I mentioned, as it relates to the great Ennead, when you look at the great Ennead of Heliopolis, it begins with Atum, the demiurge, the unmoved mover, and after matters of creation are created, the atmosphere and moisture created the earth and the night sky, then was birthed the first god-man and his wife, Set, co-regent. A cosmological system that took place in the Nile Valley during the 4th millennium BC, while her earliest attestations placed her among the divine lineage descending from Atum, as I just showed, Set's role would continue to develop over time, ultimately defining her as a guardian of sacred lineage and the embodied throne through which divine nourishment and kingship are transmitted, as we see her Horus being suckled by the original Black Madonna. Now, during the Old Kingdom, Aset's role becomes formally codified as the mistress of creative magic and the living throne of royal legitimacy. I want to highlight that ancient Kemet was a matrifocal culture where great importance was focused on the mother. So Aset wasn't just a deity. As we just mentioned, she was the living throne of royal legitimacy. In reliefs and hieroglyphs programs throughout the Nile Valley, she is repeatedly depicted enthroned and suckling her infant son Heru, a visual theology in which divine nourishment functions as the transmission of kingship itself. So the colostrum and the breast milk that is being offered to her son. And in this case, it's Aset through Heru, but it is every mother in the world. Every child that sits upon the throne of his or her mother is receiving divine nourishment through the breast milk. Now, in contrast, later Western theological frameworks that prioritize patriarchal authority Kemetic religion preserves a distinctly matrifocal model in which legitimacy, continuity, sacred power are transmitted through maternal principle for students of comparative religion. Oh, my apologies. For students of comparative religion, the appearance of similarly structured mother-centered theologies in other ancient civilizations invites a closer examination, suggesting the recurrence of a shared symbolic logic governing sovereignty, regeneration, and cosmic order. With this framework in place, I invite the audience to consider an image from outside the Nile Valley, which appears to reflect several of the same symbolic functions and theological concepts outlined in this discussion. So I want to go on the record in saying, prior to the 2nd millennium BC, I would submit that majority of high culture was matrifocal in nature, and it wasn't until the incursions of the Indo-Aryans, of certain Semitic groups, that the matrifocal order, as we know with the destruction of the Sibyls and the Sibyllines and the Sibylline oracles, as we've already mentioned, prior to that, that's what that was. I would suggest, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, I would suggest prior to the 2nd millennium BCE, things were primarily matrifocal. And then after the fact, it was patriarchal. So what I'm saying is to find other ancient cultures that happen to also show a matrifocal way of being is cause to pay attention to that and find out how that transmission was made, because it's not everyone that understands that and understands the mother as the divine source of life and nourishment in itself. For some reason, in other religious books, she's a helpmate. I don't submit, but that's where we're at. Boom! Now look at that image. Tell me that isn't interesting. This is an image coming from the Mexican representation. And what do we see here? A mother suckling her child. Now, while the names represent Horus or Isis, I want to represent that in a book called Signs and Symbols of Primordial Man by Albert Churchward, he is letting you know who he is suggesting these people to be. So in the Mexican antiquities, they are not recognizing this as Heru, nor this as Aset. But I want to ask us a question. When we looked at the throne and we first saw it seated, when we first saw Aset seated on the throne, why is it that there's a throne back there too? Is this a coincidence? Is this a random? Should this be overlooked? You tell me. So during the Tlatelolco period of pre-classical Mexican history, in between 1200 to 900 BCE, ceramic figurines depicting female figures with children appear in the archaeological record of central Mexico. Curators and scholars have interpreted these mother and child representations as symbolic expressions of a generational continuity, fertility, and social or familial roles within early indigenous Mesoamerican societies. Now, in the 19th century, some of the earliest Western facsimiles of pre-Hispanic Mesoamerican paintings and glyphic material were published in the Antiquities of Mexico, a monumental 9-volume work issued in between 1831 and 1848, under the direction of Edward King, Viscount of Kingsborough. This particular publication played a foundational role in introducing indigenous Mexican iconography, including maternal and child figures. Now, in this image from Mexican antiquity, the relief depicts a maternal figure providing nourishment to a child through the breast, a gesture that functions symbolically as the transmission of vitality, continuity, and authority as it did in the Nile Valley. Notably, the mother is seated upon a distinctly constructive throne-like form, emphasizing that the nourishment occurs within an architectural and legitimizing framework. When viewed through the lens of earlier Nile Valley theology, particularly the role of Aset and the embodied throne lineage, once again, students of comparative history beg the question, and we have to ask ourselves, how did this happen? Why are we seeing the replication or a remembrance? I like to see it as a remembrance, potential blood memory. How did it come to be that we are finding the same kind of fourfold cosmology? We're finding the same kind of matrifocal way of being, where there's a high emphasis of focus on the mother and how she is the throne of divinity and lineage who transmits that to her child on the throne. Until somebody has an answer for me, I'm throwing the information out, and we can continue to talk about it. All right, how are we so far? Are we on the same page yet? Beautiful. Ooh. So this one, the comparative analysis, I'll go even further. So, cosmic balance and the separation of opposites, a comparative theological framework. As the kind of historian I am, the kind of public speaker I am, instead of saying, this is what it is, I want to present the information, and I want to leave with the community, and I want you guys to tell me what you think about it, because I think we have something on here. So before I go into that, I'm going to read this excerpt here. It says, "This does not refer to a battle on Earth or Mexico, as Dr. Edward Sealer states, but the mythical battle between Set and Horus in one of its phases, and the hieroglyphics of the two names. It portrays Set and Horus contending for the supremacy in the equinox on the mount, with Shu as the arbiter." Okay, so once again, Shu is the representation of atmosphere. That is the first force of nature, the masculine force of nature, as it relates to atmosphere. So what it's suggesting here is Shu, the atmosphere, is serving as an arbiter between the forces of good, evil, night, day, Horus, and Set. Okay? So this you can find in the Bureau of American Ethnology of the Smithsonian Institution, affirming its status as an authentic example of Mesoamerican cosmological imagery rather than a modern fabrication. Now, as noted by pioneering scholar, this is not a real-life occurrence, but this is a motif demonstrating the separation of light, dark, day, night, order, chaos, and things of that nature. Now, within the Nile Valley theology, the role of mediation is present from the very beginning of creation. I want to highlight, as soon as the pre-creation was fulfilled with the Ogdode, Shu was the first child expressed out of the demiurge, or the unmoved mover. Now, principle from Atum upon the primordial mound. Recognizing this shared cosmological framework allows for a meaningful comparative analysis, once again, between Nile Valley theology and Mesoamerican cosmology, which is grounded not in surface resemblance, but in underlying structural principles of order, balance, and mediation. So before we move on to the other slide, I want us to really grasp what we're looking at here. One individual is representing Set, one is representing Horus, one is representing Shu, all forces of nature being kept away from one another, right? And this illustration is also coming out of Signs and Symbols of Primordial Man, Albert Churchward. Amazing read. Now look at this. Boom. So for those of you who are not familiar with what we're looking at, I want to read this excerpt. "When Shu lifted up the heavens, he formed the east, west divisions of heaven, i.e. the two horizons. Heaven had hitherto been divided into north and south only, and in doing this, standing on the equinox, he formed the royal arch, celestial. The south was represented by the pole or pillar." So what we have here is a theological, ancient African Kemetic depiction of how Shu, the masculine essence of nature, is separating the day from the night, the North Pole from the South Pole, Heru from Set, east from west. Now, in this aspect, remember how we spoke about the fourfold cosmology and the four corners of the earth? I want to look as well. The four Mayan Bacabs, the four sons of Heru on the earth, right? With Shu as atmosphere separating the heavens. So the heavens are being separated from the south. As above, so below. I want to go back to the slide about axis mundi, a relatively new word that I just learned, but I want to highlight. Is this not Shu separating day and night, order from chaos, Heru from Set? So you just got to open your eyes a little bit and realize that in its own way, people reiterate and re-express very ancient knowledge. Okay, does everyone understand what we're looking at here? Okay, once again, this stuff I consider too synchronistic to mean nothing. Where else are we seeing as parallel of an understanding, as much of a direct transmission of sacred thought and civilizing intention? Once again, when we're dealing with things of the equinox, we're dealing with heliacal, and we're dealing with stellar and solar movements that people use in ancient times to be able to anticipate how Mother Earth and Mother Nature would be working and to get in front of her, not behind her. So this was another amazing comparative analysis in which I found to be a very telltale sign that in some capacity, in some way, shape, or form, there was definitely a transmission of intelligence which may have been fully articulated at first in the Nile Valley and found its way into the Gulf of Mexico. Moving forward. Okay, so this is where we end our first segment. Each segment, we're going to be 20 slides. We got the first 20. This one, I'm not gonna lie, it was a bit trickier of a migration to prove, because everyone wants cold, hard facts. We want the facts. If you don't have the facts, it didn't happen. things aren't always that cut and dry, black or white. I did my best to really represent and demonstrate how much comparative transmission of the same divine intelligence you found from the Nile Valley into the Gulf of Mexico. And I want to highlight that the Olmecs were a people of three faces. The first were the first Paleo-Americans, the second, a Negroid Africoid strata, and the third, a mix of an amalgamation. But I do want to highlight something here. You want to see here a modern Nigerian woman with a Negroid Teotihuacan head, wearing a head handkerchief and earrings. Looks very familiar. I want to look at a few more black warrior dynasties in ancient Mexico. And this is a really amazing picture. And this one you read here is a Negroid rock mask at Chalcalzingo near Morelos in Mexico, which is dated in between 800 to 700 BCE. And it shows a stylized of somebody who has plastered their face in the rock with their hand up here. Now, I want to highlight that Alexander von Wutenhau notes that similarity to the braceleted arm of an Assyrian king, this kind of hand seal was also seen in the 25th dynasty when the Nubian king Shabaka stamped his hand in wet clay beside that of an Assyrian king to sign the seal of the truce. So once again, things of this nature we have to highlight. How synchronistic and how likely and how random is it that things that are happening in the Nile Valley popped up in La Venta, Tres Zapotes, San Lorenzo. I think that there's too much here to wave off, to laugh at, to mock, to ridicule. And given the historicity of circumnavigation around the continent of Africa, given the validity of peer-reviewed journalism, which attests to the calendrical order and the seasonal methods in which early Mesoamerican studies used to erect their architecture, which is very much in alignment with how they did the Nile Valley, I suppose there may indeed be something here. And I am submitting and I am following the works of Ivan van Sertima, where I am introducing the concept and the feeling and the notion and the imagery and the historicity of an African presence in deep antiquity throughout the Gulf of Mexico and Mesoamerica. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of our first segment. We now can sit, integrate with this. I would love, if anyone has any questions and answers, I would love you guys to feel free to shoot them up, raise your hand. But this is more of a discussion. This is the first time that I don't have a script. Once again, shout out my first lady, encouraged me to lean into my heart. This is a freestyle. But I hope you guys enjoyed this first segment. The second one is going to be even better. Mad journalism, mad academic papers, visual illustrations off the chain. So with that, in between that, we got soup from a lovely Greenhouse Vegan Catering. Thank you, Chin. We got a performance by Main Issue. And I believe our beloved MC, Masters of Ceremonies, will allow us to have a clean segue. And I really appreciate everyone. I hope you guys enjoy the Nile Valley cosmology, the womb cosmology, the architecture, and let's get it in.